Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Adamson, the chairman of Forum Europe, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to day 2 of the European Cybersecurity Summer Hub. Today, we're going to take a broader view on day 2 and talking about the EU and global conversations. My first task is to introduce our opening keynote address, which will be given by John Suffolk, who's Senior Vice President, Global Cybersecurity Officer at Huawei, who will be talking about the global impact of the pandemic and how it links with the cybersecurity challenges we are now increasingly facing. So without further ado, I will hand over to John, and time permitting, at the end of his intervention, we'll be taking questions in the time available. So please feel free to post your questions as have already been indicated. Without further ado, over to you, John.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Forum Europe. I'm delighted to open the second day, but let me start with a little bit of reflection on the similarities between a pandemic and our journey in terms of technology. The pandemic is not the first one. If you go back 70 years, we had Zika, we've had 40 years of Ebola, we had SARS 8 years ago, MERS 5 years ago, and now the terrible wrath of COVID. And scientists will tell you that this is all accelerating. If you mirror that to technology over the last 40 years, technology is accelerating from, more recently, the brilliant invention of the smartphone by Apple, an app for everything, drives cloud computing, big data, which is driving artificial intelligence. And what surrounds all of that is connectivity. If you look at the way that we are using connectivity and the sharing of knowledge on the pandemic, it's what we do in business. We've accelerated from 2G to 3G to 4G and the hot topic of 5G. There are also lessons of limitations. The science is limited in terms of solving the virus or coming up with a vaccine. We are limited on our science in terms of coming up with always safe technology. We are limited in terms of our supply chains and the importance and fragility of the supply chains. And if you just look at, we've had to re-educate people in terms of the importance of hygiene, washing your hands all of the time for 20 seconds. And we never have a cybersecurity conference when we don't talk about basics hygiene of security. So a number of similarities in terms of the path that these events have taken. But I think some of the similarities stop there. If you look at laws and culture, the laws around the world and regionally, and even within some countries, are fragmented. They're piecemeal. They're often built for an analog age, not a digital age. And those laws don't build trust. They build complexity and confusion. And if you truly look at trust between governments around the world and countries, it is getting worse. It is not getting better. And I think we have to have an honest conversation. On the one hand, governments say to us, you must be secure. You must do X, Y, and Z. But on the other hand, their security teams like the NSA or the GCHQ in the UK are hacking merrily. They're buying zero-day vulnerabilities. So on the one hand, they say be safe, and on the other hand, they're breaking the law in many countries. And therefore, why should any self-respecting person or enterprise respect anyone who says it's okay to go and break in and to steal? Cultures are also very, very different. The American culture, which is, I want to be number one, I want the greatest growth, I want the greatest profitability, I want to be the world leader, has dominated what they do, and they are incredibly brilliant at doing this. What is the equivalent European culture? It's let's work as a team, let's get 100 companies together on Gaia X, let's manage by committee, and we're policy driven, we're not commerce driven. So America will drive for commerce first and drive for the win first rather than the policy, where Europe gives the impression, and I think it's reality, and I'm happy to be challenged, drives for policy first and commerce is second. And therefore the challenge for us in terms of Europe is to know what we can be good at. Are we going to truly compete with the greats, the Americas, the sheer scale of China? If you look at the top 500 supercomputers, 219, 20 are in China, 116, 17 are in America. So you need to think about the driving and the capability that you have. Let me, if I may, use two examples. I want to use the 5G toolbox, and I know we had a very good session on this yesterday, and I want to use GDPR as two examples. The toolbox is a great invention. But my starting question is, and I have this conversation with businesses around the world, is what's the purpose? What is the purpose of the toolbox? Is the purpose of the toolbox to maximize the adoption of 5G? Is the purpose of the toolbox to really generate new business from the new technology, to create new jobs which are likely to be lost because of the adoption of artificial intelligence? Or is the purpose of the toolbox to limit the adoption? And it might not be a conscious limitation, but unconsciously, through policies and processes and assessments, it limits the adoption. And I would just say to you, show me the 5G toolbox in America. Show me the 5G toolbox in South Korea or Singapore or in much of the Middle East. They are rapidly adopting things like 5G and artificial intelligence. They're inventing new business models. And what we're doing is a toolbox which could have an unintended consequence of putting Europe in the slow lane. Now look at GDPR. In my opinion, GDPR is a brilliant bit of regulation. It's outcome orientated. It tells you what the outcome is. It doesn't tell you how to deliver the outcome in detail. It defines roles and responsibilities, but it makes accountability clear. It is the accountability of the data controller. This was meant to be our nirvana. And yet, 2 years on, we have other regulations. We have PECRA, the electronic communications. We have e-privacy. We've been discussing for 2 years, and we can't agree wording. And we can't agree wording because it conflicts with GDPR. We have industry saying, like e-mobility, that regulation will stop the adoption. We've got people talking about stopping CCTV or facial recognition, question marks out of AI. And I have to say, the word no is not very creative. It's not very commercial. And therefore, when we have brilliant things like GDPR, rather than the EU, the way it's structured, where each directorate and commission comes up with a new directive or a new regulation, and they kind of like overlap with other directives and regulations, all that does is layers complexity and cost into the commercial environment. And that means it doesn't make us an attractive place to invest all of the time. And let me give you one example. If I'm an investor and I can choose America, I can choose Europe, I can choose somewhere in Asia, take one Chinese city, Chengdu. Now, you may have heard of Chengdu because it's the home of the panda. What you may not know is 288 of Fortune 500 companies do their pure and applied research in Chengdu. And they do it in Chengdu because the outcome, the policies are driving innovation on life sciences, driving innovation in terms of pharma and nanotechnology and quantum and big data. So not only that, their policies drive the production of PhDs. Huawei has over 3,000 PhDs. But if you want to do lots of pure research, you need the academic capability. So where do you go? You go to where it's produced. We do this at Huawei. We go to Milan for microwave research. We go to the Nordics for telecommunications research and quantum and mathematical algorithms. And therefore, Europe needs to work out, in essence, what its core strength is. Can it really be a global player? So Gaia-X is brilliant, but it's designed by committee. And I sit here wondering, does France want Germany to dominate, or does Germany want France to dominate, or will nobody dominate? And what we do is we layer down our aspiration. You know, my worry is our culture sometimes in Europe is there are no losers, everybody's a winner. But the culture in America is, no, I'm going to be the winner. I want the greatest market share. I want the greatest growth. I want the greatest profitability. They have the killer instinct. So we need to ask ourselves some questions in terms of what we can do. And I think, in essence, we are not short of capability. We are not short of passion and capacity in Europe. We need to know where we're going to focus it on. We can produce great security companies, but we need to choose the battles that we're going to fight in terms of what on security. We can't be leaders of security and technology if we're not leaders or really adopting the technology. Because unless you're adopting the technology on the upward curve, it's hard for you in terms of security to understand the risks that the upward curve is producing, or even where you have come from. If you go back almost 40 years, today we are still trying to secure the humble personal computer. And therefore, when you're talking of the complexity of artificial intelligence, where you're trying to train the algorithms, it's not just about, is the algorithm transparent and can you understand it? It's what are the consequences? What are the behavioral sciences that have gone into your training data? Is there racial bias in the training data? Well, how do you know? So suddenly security takes on a broader concept. And if you're not on the upward curve on investment on the use of and adoption of the technology, it's hard for you to really be at the forefront of the security technology. So my wish really for Europe is, whether it's brilliance of an amalgam of cultures, the way that we can work together, the way we can share information, is to really think about where we're going to be in terms of the adoption of technology. Are we going to go to a digital backwater because we are swamped with policies and regulations, which is about coming up with a level playing field? Or are we going to go to be the champions? If we're going to be the champions, it takes a different mindset. So you can't have security without the right mindset. You can't have security without the right culture. And at that point, I'd like to stop for a few questions and I'll hand back to Paul. Paul, thank you very much.
A lot of bold assertions there, which I feel duty bound to push back on, certainly. As you know, John, the European Union prides itself that it is a rules-based organization. That is how it operates. And you talk about this European culture being policy-driven, not commerce-driven. But that is the way things are done in Europe. Do you see, having said that, do you see any signs from your vantage point under the auspices of this new commission, which is only 6 months old, which seems to be more aware of the business dimension? We have an ex-CEO of a major European tech company, Thierry Breton, now in charge of a number of European portfolios inside the European Commission. Do you see any sign that there's more of a recognition that the Commission has to do, and the EU, by extension, has to do things rather differently going forward?
So I think the initial signs are promising and very encouraging, but it didn't take America 1 or 5 years to become great. It hasn't taken China 1 or 5 years to build its infrastructure. So I think the signs are there, but as you know, with the parliamentary process, there's a fixed cycle. So this has to be a cultural issue between the Commission and the member states. The member states need to be perfectly aligned behind the ambition of the Commission and the policy and the visions that we're setting. Because if we diverse across the 27 member states, because the member states want to be number one, member states want to mirror America in terms of their approach to commerce, then we're not going to achieve our objectives. So I'm encouraged by the early signs, but I sit here skeptical because there are too many quiet voices in the member state.
Well, on these quiet voices, one of the rationales of European regulation is, of course, to replace 27 disparate national laws with one single European law, to use very simplistic language. And increasingly, without being too hubristic, the European Union is being recognized by outside players, not just internally, as an exporter of regulation, the so-called Brussels effect. I don't think, to be fair to you, you were trying to make the case for a deregulation free-for-all out there, but do you at least recognize the importance of the European Union as trying to create, at the very least, a single market in regulation?
So I think the single market in regulation is excellent, but let's be honest here about the reality. Take GDPR. Germany has over 200 variations to GDPR. So when we talk of single regulation, because member states are given derogation rights, it doesn't end up as a single regulation. So we start off with a vision. We start off with perfectly worded, brilliantly worded regulations such as GDPR, but they fragment and they decay quickly over time. So I fully agree and I fully support, as does Huawei, our approach to privacy, the way that we've
I'm afraid you've frozen, at least on my screen, John. Is John frozen on other people's screens? You're back. You're back in the room.
Yes, I'm back. Thank you.
So carry on. We missed the last.
Yeah. So my belief is, we fully support the approach that Europe takes in terms of holistic rules and regulations, but they mustn't let it decay so quickly as GDPR is decaying so quickly.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we have a hard stop at 9:25 because the next session is starting promptly. So it's a great shame. You made so many important and provocative points in your opening intervention, John. We must return to this discussion as soon as possible. There's a lot of things to discuss there and to unpack. Thank you very much for your time. That concludes the session. The next session, as you all know from the program, is on global supply chains, and you can head over to that session now, which will be starting very shortly. And please don't forget that all the sessions are recorded, and if you miss anything, you will be able to watch the replays at your leisure, and my colleagues at Forum Europe will be sending you details of all that. So without further ado, please make your way over to the next session now on global supply chains, and thank you again.